So here we are, my first video as a YouTuber from my own channel, the Atlantis Theory. That name may or may not change. I quite like it, so we're sticking with it for now. Before the main video starts, I just also want to say, this is my first video. My editing skills are not the best. I'm aware of that. It'll be a work in progress, but if you're here from the start, then fantastic. And if you're here in the future, also fantastic. Secondly, for every 50 subscribers I get, I'm going to be donating £10 to Mind, the mental health charity. It's a cause that's ultimately just super important to me, and I want to do as much as I can to support that. So, let's get started. So the Atlantis Theory is going to be a channel dedicated mainly to comic book material. So the DCEU, the MCU, news, rumours, trailer breakdowns, characters, all that kind of information. Stuff that I've just loved all my life because I grew up reading comic books and a big fan of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And the DC Extended Universe is starting to pick up, but it's had a very rocky start, to put it lightly. So on that note, my first video is going to be about characters in the DC Extended Universe. Specifically, 5 characters that I wish or hope to see in the next few years in the films. With Aquaman and Shazam, DC proved they can make good, fun, entertaining, and comic accurate films. And I think following the theme of Aquaman and Shazam, DC should, for now at least, focus on lesser known or underappreciated characters and focus on smaller storylines rather than building up a big shared universe like the MCU did. I'm sure they can get to that in the future, and I hope they do, because I'd love to see people like Darkseid on the screen. But for now, they should just focus on kind of smaller stories, singular characters, maybe team-ups, but that's it for now, really. So first on my list, and this isn't my favourite, I'm kind of going in reverse order, is Martian Manhunter. Martian Manhunter is a crazy underappreciated and underrated character. I know a lot of comic book fans that have kind of read a lot of DC and they still don't know much about him, and that's not entirely his fault. In terms of the character himself, he's got a crazy array of powers. Like he's as powerful as Superman, if not more. In fact, Superman and Batman have both commented on John Johns, the Martian Manhunter, is potentially one of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy. So, it kind of says about the potential he has. Yet he's also nowhere near as famous as Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, pretty much any of the main Justice League members. And he was one of the founding members of the Justice League in the comic. So, I think this would work in his favour because he's nowhere near as famous. There would be hardly any pressure on the film to succeed, and the range of stories you could tell were so varied as well. Not to mention that because he's a character that you can go into space and he could explore various planets, that could be a good character to use to introduce or hint at various kind of Green Lantern villains or other villains from the cosmos that could then come into play much later on. I think he'd work well as a solo film character, but he could also be used later on to spark a kind of Justice League character films when the time came about, when DC were finally at a time they could build up to a successful Justice League kind of film and universe. So I think Martian Manhunter is kind of maybe a bit of an out there choice, a bit of a bold choice, but ultimately I think a choice that would be very worthwhile for the DCEU. Next up is Mr. Terrific, and he is one of my favourite comic book characters. He's a really underrated character. He's packed full of potential. I just think he's so interesting, really. I'm going to try not to ramble too much about him. He shares a lot of similarities with Batman, actually. Mr. Terrific and Batman, they both have gadgets, they both use tech, they're both skilled fighters. Batman has a obsession with naming everything that he owns Bat something, and Mr. Terrific does the same, but it's T something, including his signature T mask, which is an interesting concept on its own. It's a mask that makes him immune or invisible almost to all forms of electronic detection. That right there is enough to make a film. That's just so interesting to me. And he has his T-spheres, which are kind of signature weapons almost. They're like these robotic spheres that float alongside him or follow him, and they have a set of capabilities for him to use. With someone like Ryan Coogler behind the project, Mr. Terrific would be like a perfect thing or a perfect character for DC to use right now. He could be ground zero for recruiting characters of a similar level, but also stand in for Batman while they figure out what they're doing with Batman and the Trinity. I just think it would be like a wasted opportunity to not use Mr. Terrific. So we arrive at the top 3 now of this list anyway, and third place is Red Hood, and is a bit of an interesting one, or a harder one to kind of want in the DCEU, because he's a character that's very closely attached to Batman, and we don't really know what's happening with Batman in the DCEU. Ben Affleck supposedly stepped down, and Matt Reeves' film The Batman that comes out next year may be set in the DC continuity, but we don't really know. A lot of reports are saying it's not. So Batman is a character that you have to have in place before you can bring Red Hood in. He was the second Robin, he died and then was resurrected, taking on the character or the mantle of Red Hood and going after Batman himself. Would totally recommend reading that story, by the way. Batman Under the Red Hood, one of the best comic book stories ever. However, back to the matter at hand, I so want to see Red Hood in the DCEU. I'm prepared to wait a long time for it to happen, but I'm going to die eventually, and I'd rather see it before then. And a few years back, Jensen Ackles would have been the perfect casting, but he's just too old for it now. There's so many reasons that I want Red Hood in the DCEU, but DC have just got to decide on what they're doing with Batman, and ultimately that will dictate how Red Hood and when Red Hood can be brought into the DCEU, which is a shame, unfortunately. Next up, we have Zatanna, and there's 2 reasons why I want to see Zatanna in the DCEU. One, she's one of my most favourite comic book characters ever. I think she's just so interesting, and I'm going to really try and not go overboard on that. Secondly, she's attached very heavily to Constantine and the Justice League Dark, which is, for people that don't know, it's a kind of like a variation of the Justice League that deals with these supernatural beings that Justice League can't deal with, because a lot of the Justice League members are super weak to magic. So Zatanna is part of the team, which normally consists of herself, Constantine, Swamp Thing, and Batman occasionally appears, and at the moment Wonder Woman's part of them too, because she's less susceptible to magic damage. However, Zatanna would be a perfect character to introduce in her own series of solo films, and then also slowly introduce the kind of DC magical side of the universe, building up to and branching out with other characters that could make the Justice League dark. Constantine would probably work just as well, but I prefer Zatanna to Constantine, so that's why I would pick Zatanna over Constantine. However, that brings us to first place now, which is Green Arrow, and I have wanted Green Arrow to appear in the DCEU in his own film since Man of Steel came out, if not before that. When DC announced they were making a cinematic universe, I thought Green Arrow would be a perfect character to kind of lead the way almost, closely behind Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman, because of course they were going to be the main focus. Especially after seeing Logan, directed by James Mangold, I was convinced that, and I have not wavered from this, a James Mangold, dark, gritty, Green Arrow film would be perfect. And then on top of that, as Birds of Prey is coming out soon, which is introducing Black Canary into the DCEU, adding Green Arrow on top of that could spark a film for their relationship to be explored, which could also then bring in Deathstroke, who is one of my favourite villains ever. Ultimately, I think Green Arrow would be just a perfect character to bring in whenever. He could be brought in the future, when it's been kind of established a bit more. He could be brought in now. I think he's just such an interesting character with an interesting set of villains and friends/relationships. I think DC really need to use him, and I think they will at some point, but they're just kind of taking their time with him. Anyway, that's my first video, and those are 5 characters that I wish will be in the DCEU soon, within the next few years, possibly, hopefully. So yeah, thanks for watching if you managed to make it to the end. Remember, if for every 50 subscribers I get, I'm going to donate £10 to Mind charity, and that amount may vary in the future as well, depending on how successful the channel grows. And I will catch you next time, when I'm going to be hopefully talking about potential directors that could tackle bringing the X-Men into the MCU. So